The horizon was nothing but dust and silence, except for the faint trace of laughter that seemed to linger long after the men were gone. She sat in the dirt where they had left her, arms bound in rough splints, her breath sharp and shallow. The world felt heavier than her body could bear. Wind lifted strands of her hair, catching against her damp cheeks, carrying away her tears, as though even they weren't hers to keep. The ground beneath her held the imprint of boots, their cruelty stamped into the earth. She could still hear them, voices sharp, as if cruelty was a game to fill their emptiness. They had broken her arms for nothing but their own pleasure, and she was left with the kind of silence that screamed louder than any cry. This town had never truly seen her. To them, she was only a pair of hands, useful when she could work, invisible when she could not. She had come here years ago with little but determination, patching together her living with laundry, mending, and whatever odd jobs others refused. The children sometimes mocked her crooked walk from years of labor. The women clutched their husbands tighter when she passed, and the men saw no reason to treat her like more than the dust under their boots. She had learned to live with that. But this cruelty for sport left her hollow, as if the marrow of her bones had been stolen alongside her dignity. Her arms hung useless at her sides, splints pressing hard against bruised flesh. They felt like broken wings, useless for flight, a bird cast out of the sky. She had thought she had grown numb to cruelty, that years of being overlooked and underestimated had armored her heart. Yet when they left her there in the dirt, laughter still echoing, she realized numbness was an illusion. Pain still cut deep when it chose to. And the sharpest cut of all was not the bone splintered inside her arms, but the way no one had come running. She forced herself to stand, staggering against the weight of her own body. People passed her by on the street, some slowing to glance, then turning away as though her suffering might cling to them if they lingered too long. A few muttered half-hearted concern, their voices brittle, already shifting to gossip before they had even walked out of earshot. She wanted to scream at them, to demand that someone look her in the eye and acknowledge her as more than a broken thing. But the scream never came. Instead, she walked home alone, each step like dragging chains. She remembered another face then, one she had once believed would protect her. A man she had given her trust to. He had seemed strong once, steady in a way that made her think maybe life would finally grow softer. But when she stood before him now, arms bound, voice trembling as she asked for help, he turned cold. His eyes slid over her like she was no more than a burden dropped at his door. "You'll need too much looking after," he said, voice flat, as if he were speaking about livestock too lame to keep. "I've got no use for trouble." The words didn't come with anger. They came with dismissal, as though she were nothing worth raising his voice over. That was what made it cut so deep. She would have preferred a shout, a slammed door, even a fist. But instead she was left with the echo of a man who couldn't even be bothered to fight for her. He turned his back and walked away, and she stood there trembling, her broken arms heavy as stone, her heart heavier still. The town whispered after that. At the well, where women drew water, she heard the murmur. Some pitied her, though pity was cold comfort. Others sneered, voices sharp with judgment, saying she had probably brought it on herself somehow. She lowered her gaze and carried the whispers like extra weight on her shoulders. It was an older woman, gray hair braided tight and eyes hardened by years, who stopped beside her one morning. The woman's hands were rough, scarred from a lifetime of work, her back slightly bent. She leaned close, voice low, so only she could hear. "Don't wait for others to save you," the woman said. "They'll let you rot before they lift a finger." The words carried no kindness, but they were honest, and honesty sometimes carried more mercy than 100 soft lies. Still, even with that advice, the girl felt adrift. The world seemed too big, her body too broken. Every simple task had turned into a battlefield, fetching water, cooking, even buttoning her dress. She felt stripped of her independence, the thing she had fought hardest to keep. It was then she saw him for the first time. A quiet figure riding into town, his hat pulled low, his coat dusty from the trail. He didn't come with a smile or with swagger like the others. He came with silence, with a presence that seemed steady as the earth itself. He dismounted without hurry, tied his horse, and walked through the street as if he had always belonged to no place and yet fit anywhere. He bought supplies, spoke little, and when spoken to, his words were simple and low. She noticed him before she knew he had noticed her. But she felt it, the way his eyes lingered, not with pity, not with mockery, but with a weight that saw her differently. It was only a glance, brief, but it was enough to stir something she had not felt in a long time, the sense of being truly seen. Still, he did not step in. He did not cross the distance between them. He bought his supplies, mounted his horse, and rode out, leaving only the faint rhythm of hooves against dry earth. That night, in her small cabin, the weight of everything pressed down harder than before. She tried to light her lamp, her arms trembling, the splints awkward and painful. The flames sputtered, shadows stretched long, and tears blurred her vision until she could no longer see. She sank onto her bed, arms aching, heart raw, and let the sobs come, muffled into her pillow. The sound filled the cabin, a hollow music of sorrow and exhaustion. Outside, the night wrapped itself around the town, stars sharp against the black sky. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a cowboy rode beneath that same sky, quiet and steady. He had seen her, though she didn't know it yet, and though she lay in her cabin alone, her tears staining the sheets, the story of her broken wings was not finished. Not yet. The morning came with a pale gold light, soft against the horizon. She rose slowly, every movement reminding her of what had been taken, of how little she could now do without pain. Her arms throbbed in their splints, heavy and stiff. At the well, she tried to balance the wooden bucket with her hip, but it was too much. The handle slipped, the bucket toppled, water spilling like wasted silver across the dirt. It rolled a few feet, wobbling, and then settled on its side. She stood frozen, shame burning hotter than the sun overhead. Laughter drifted from nearby, boys leaning against a post, amused at her clumsiness, women whispering behind palms, their eyes sharp with judgment. She lowered her gaze and bit her lip until she tasted blood. The world had always been unkind, but now it seemed to take pleasure in her struggle. Cooking was near impossible. Her bread came out burned, her stew thin and bitter because she could not stir it properly. Sewing, once her livelihood, mocked her with dropped needles and tangled thread. Carrying water, splitting wood, sweeping floors. All simple things turned into cruel tests she could not pass. She felt reduced, less than herself, and each day seemed to strip another layer of dignity. It was on one such morning, as she knelt in the dirt trying to scoop up what little water remained in the bucket, that she noticed a shadow fall across her. She looked up, and there he stood, the cowboy. His hat brim cast his eyes in shadow, but she felt his gaze upon her. He said nothing, only watched. For a moment she thought he might laugh too, that he might join the chorus of mockery that seemed to follow her. But he didn't. He simply bent down, lifted the bucket with ease, and set it back upright. He didn't hand it to her, didn't linger, didn't even meet her eyes directly. He just straightened and walked on, boots steady against the ground. She stared after him, the sound of his steps fading, and for the first time in weeks, she felt a different kind of heat in her chest. Not shame, but something quieter, harder to name. The days that followed, she began to notice him more. Or perhaps he had always been there, and she had never looked close enough. He didn't intrude on her solitude, but his presence seemed to ripple through her days. She woke one morning to find her fence, long sagging and broken, set right. The wood was freshly hammered, nails driven deep. No one had come to tell her they'd done it, but she knew. She saw the print of his boots in the dirt and the faint smell of horse lingering on the air. Another day, she opened her door to find a bucket of water waiting for her, full to the brim, clean and cold. She looked around, but the street was empty. She carried it inside with difficulty, her arms aching, but her heart lighter than it had been. He never sought thanks, never knocked on her door, never drew attention to himself. His kindness lived in silence, in shadows. Their paths crossed in small ways. Once, she dropped a loaf of bread as she tried to carry it home from a bakery. The crust split, crumbs scattering across the dust. Before she could stoop to pick it up, His boots appeared in her vision. He knelt, gathered it, and placed it carefully into her basket. He didn't speak, didn't even give a nod. Just moved on as if the act had been as natural as breathing. She stood still for a long moment, bread in her hands, her eyes following his retreating figure. Another time, she sat outside her cabin, her arms throbbing worse than usual, fever creeping through her body. She tried to hide it, pulling her shawl tighter, willing her face not to show the pain. But when he passed, she saw it in his eyes. He had noticed. He didn't stop, didn't pry, but he gave her a look that told her he saw more than she wished to reveal. She felt stripped bare under that gaze, yet not ashamed. He respected her silence, her choice to carry her pain in private. There was dignity in that, and she clung to it. A bond began to form, not in words, but in the spaces between them. It was in the way he seemed to appear when her burdens grew heaviest, and in the way she let herself notice his presence without fear. He was not like the others. He did not demand, did not take, did not mock. He simply existed beside her, as though the very act of sharing the air she breathed was enough. The town began to notice, too. Whispers carried on the wind like burrs. Some mocked him openly. That cowboy's wasting time on her, they said at the saloon. He must be desperate to keep company with a woman so broken. Laughter rang against the wooden walls, sharp and ugly. But he never responded, never changed his quiet rhythm. One evening, an old ranch hand leaned against a fence post as the cowboy tied his horse nearby. The old man's eyes were cloudy, his hands rough with age. He spoke in a low voice, not unkind but heavy with warning. "Be careful with her," the old man said. "She's been hurt too deep. A man could lose himself trying to fix something the world already decided to break." The cowboy adjusted the knot on his reins, his jaw tight. He didn't answer, didn't even look at the ranch hand. He just mounted his horse, gave a slight tug on the reins, and rode away into the fading light. Silence was his only reply, but it carried more weight than words could. As the days drew longer, summer pressing down on the town with its heavy heat, she felt the shift within herself. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was something softer, like the first green sprout pushing through hard soil. She still struggled, still stumbled, still cried when the nights grew long and lonely. But now, there was a sense that maybe someone out there saw her not as a burden, but as something worth watching over, even from afar. One night, as the sun sank and the shadows grew long in her cabin, she sat by her table, bandages heavy and soaked from the day's work. She tried to light a lamp, her fingers clumsy, the match slipping twice before sparking at last. Her face shone pale in the glow, tears streaking down her cheeks. She whispered into the darkness, her voice cracked and low. "Why am I still here?" The words hung in the air, fragile and aching. She thought she was alone. But outside, unseen in the night, the cowboy leaned against a post, his hat tipped back, his eyes fixed on the stars. He didn't hear her words, but somehow, in the way he stood steady against the silence, it was as though he were answering anyway. Spring arrived softly, with skies that wept more often than they cleared, and the earth turned slick with mud that clung to boots and hems alike. She stepped outside her cabin one morning as the rain began to ease, the ground beneath her slick and treacherous. Her arms, still weak, could not steady her when she slipped, and for a moment the world tilted, threatening to send her into the mud. But before she could fall, hands caught her. Strong, sure, and gentle. He set her upright, not pulling, not gripping too hard, simply lifting her back into balance. She looked up, rain dripping from her lashes, and found the cowboy's eyes on her. They did not speak. The silence between them was enough. After that day, his presence grew less shadowed. He came not to watch from afar, but to help openly, though still without ceremony. Firewood began to appear by her door in neat stacks, cut and ready. The garden behind her cabin, long choked by weeds she could no longer tend, showed signs of care, rows straightened, soil turned. She knew it was his doing, though he never once announced it. At first, she bristled, shame prickling at the back of her neck. She had always lived by her own hands, by her own effort. To accept help now felt like losing what little independence she had left. But the quiet persistence of his kindness wore her resistance down. He never pressed, never looked for gratitude, never demanded anything in return. He simply did. And when she saw the small green shoots rising from her patch garden, or felt the warmth of a fire lit with which she had not needed to carry, something inside her softened. One afternoon, she sat on her porch, the sun breaking through clouds for the first time in days. He approached, leading his horse by the reins, his steps steady and unhurried. He tipped his hat, a small gesture, and set a bundle of herbs on the table beside her. She looked at them, then at him, and for the first time since her arms had been broken, her lips curved into a smile. Small, faint, but true. He saw it, and though his expression did not change much, his eyes carried a quiet light. It was in the evenings that words finally came. They sat by the fire inside her cabin, shadows dancing along the walls, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke. At first, their conversations were simple. He asked if she needed anything. She told him little of her day, of how the bread burned again, of how she hated the clumsy way she now tied her dress. But in the pauses, in the warmth of the fire between them, something unspoken grew. Then one night his voice, low and even, carried a story. He spoke of the road, of miles ridden alone, of silence that stretched so wide it threatened to swallow him. He mentioned a woman once, not with names or details, just the outline of loss, the kind that leaves a man wandering because staying still feels too painful. His words were spare, but they carried weight, and she felt them settle into her chest like stones. She realized then that he, too, carried wounds. They were not on his body, not splinted and wrapped like hers, but they lived in him all the same. The silence after he spoke was not empty. It was warm, a space where her heart leaned closer to his without needing to touch. Another evening, the rain drummed against the roof, and she asked him softly why he helped her. He shrugged, eyes fixed on the fire, and said only, "Because I see you." She turned her face away then, tears rising quick and unbidden. To be seen, truly seen, was a gift greater than any pile of wood or bucket of water. Her body, still fragile, betrayed her one night. Fever gripped her, the wound along her arm red and angry with infection. She tried to hide it, tried to grit her teeth and bear it, but when he found her trembling in her bed, sweat shining on her brow, he stayed. He sat beside her through the long hours, cooling her face with a damp cloth, changing her bandages with hands surprisingly gentle for their size. He spoke little, only murmuring a word now and then, but the sound of his voice kept her tethered when the fever threatened to pull her under. She drifted in and out of sleep. Once, in the pale hours before dawn, she woke to find him slumped in a chair beside her bed, hat fallen into his lap, his face softened by sleep. Her hand, weak and small, had somehow found its way into his, and he had not let it go. She watched him breathe, steady and slow, and whispered words she had not even known were waiting in her heart. "I don't feel broken when you're near." Her voice was barely more than a breath, and he did not stir. But she felt the truth of it settle over her like a blanket, warm against the chill of her fever. The town did not look kindly on their closeness. Whispers grew sharper, laughter meaner. At the saloon, men jeered that the cowboy had taken to caring for a useless woman, that he'd chained himself to dead weight. Some women scoffed that no decent man would waste his time on her when so many others were whole and strong. But he never answered them, never changed his steady course. He kept walking the same path, his silence a wall they could not breach. The more they mocked, the more his loyalty deepened, as if each cruel word was a stone that only made his foundation stronger. She saw it in the way he looked at her, not as something to pity, not as a burden, but as someone who mattered. And slowly, she began to believe it too. Her arms grew stronger, the splints removed at last, though the ache remained. She practiced moving them, slow and cautious, each gesture a small victory. And one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fire, she stepped close to him. Her arms trembled as she lifted them, but she did. She wrapped them around him, weak but willing, pressing her face into his chest. It was not romance. It was not passion. It was gratitude, trust, a silent declaration that she no longer stood alone in the world. He did not move for a long moment. Then his hands rested lightly against her back, steady as always. And for the first time in a long while, she felt not broken, not abandoned, not invisible. She felt held. The world beyond them might still jeer, might still wound. But in that moment, in that embrace, there was only the quiet promise that healing was possible. That broken wings could, in time, learn again the shape of flight. Dust rose like a living thing, swirling through the late afternoon light as the thunder of hooves tore across the earth. The town, small and brittle with fear, went silent. Every shutter pulled back just enough for eyes to peek out, then shut again. A handful of men rode in with the same cruel laughter that had haunted her nights, sharp as knives against the quiet. Their silhouettes grew large in the dust. Shadows of violence returned to finish what they had started. She stood outside her cabin, trembling, her breath caught in her chest. The old fear gnawed at her bones, the memories flooding back with each echo of hooves. But this time, she was not alone. The cowboy stepped forward from where he had been waiting in the shade of the post. His hat brim low, his shoulders straight. The quiet weight of his presence pressed against the storm coming their way. His hand rested near his belt, but not on it. His voice carried in a low, steady tone that cut across their laughter. "Turn back," he said. Just 2 words. The men reined up, circling like wolves, dust settling around them. Their leader, broad-shouldered with a sneer carved into his face, spat into the dirt. "Ain't your business, stranger." His gaze slid toward her, that cruel grin widening. "We left something undone." The townsfolk, who had gathered at the edges of the street, turned their eyes away. None stepped forward. None spoke. The silence of the town weighed heavier than the guns strapped to those men's sides. She felt the fear clawing at her throat, but when she looked at the cowboy, standing unshaken, she felt something stir, something stronger than fear. He gave them one chance. Leave her be. His voice was not raised, but it carried finality, like stone laid on a grave. Laughter cut the air. The men slid from their saddles, boots heavy on the dirt. They moved like they had before, with the certainty of men who had never been stopped, who had never been told no. Then everything broke. The sound of fists, the crack of bone, the sharp report of a gun. The standoff turned violent, raw and fast, not some dance of glory, but survival played out in blood and dust. The cowboy moved with the grit of a man who had fought before, not for pride, but because he had to. One fell with a cry, another stumbled back, clutching his jaw. The leader drew, steel flashing, and the crack of the shot tore the silence apart. The cowboy staggered, blood blooming dark across his shirt. For a heartbeat, she thought he would fall. The world tilted, spinning with the taste of fear, but he stayed upright, his eyes burning steady, his body holding ground as if his soul refused to give. He struck once more, and the last of them faltered, their cruelty collapsing beneath a strength they had not expected. The dust began to settle. The men, bruised and broken, scrambled back to their horses. Their laughter was gone now, replaced with curses spat through split lips. One muttered threats, but even as he did, his eyes avoided the cowboy's steady gaze. They rode out as quickly as they had come, their retreat as loud as their arrival had been. Silence fell again, thicker than before. The townsfolk, who had turned their backs, peeked from doorways, their shame etched in their faces. None spoke to her. None stepped forward. Yet she felt something shift in the way they looked, not pity this time, not laughter. Something closer to recognition, as if they could no longer deny her strength, her survival, her dignity reclaimed in blood and defiance. Her legs trembled as she crossed the dirt, her shadow stretching long in the fading light. The cowboy leaned against her doorway, his breath rough, blood streaking his side. His hat had fallen in the fight, his face pale but unbroken. She reached for him, hands shaking but steady enough to guide him inside. The roles were reversed now. Where once he had lifted her, carried her, shielded her, it was she who steadied him, she who would not let him fall. Inside, the glow of the fire cracked warm against the night that pressed at the windows. He sank into a chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. She fetched water, her bandaged arms weak but determined, wiping the blood from his brow. He did not speak, only watched her with the same quiet strength he had always given. Her hands, once broken and useless, now trembled not with pain, but with purpose. She traced the rough edge of his palm with her fingers, steady for the first time in so long. Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but it carried more weight than any shout. "My arms are healing," she said. "Not just the bones." He closed his eyes, not in weariness, but in understanding, as though her words answered something unspoken in him too. The firelight flickered, shadows bending against the walls, wrapping them in a silence that was no longer empty. She did not need to say, "Thank you." He did not need to hear it. Between them lay something stronger, something born not from words, but from survival, from patience, from the kind of trust that only grows in the dark places where the world tries to break you. And in that silence, the truth rose like dawn itself. Sometimes the world shatters us without reason, leaves us scattered and raw. But sometimes, if we are lucky, it sends someone steady, someone quiet, someone who knows how to mend what cannot be seen. And in that mending, wounds grow wings. The fire burned low, the night wrapped close, and for the first time, she did not feel broken at all.